President Biden will meet with the British Prime Minister Keir Starmer over at the White House. They will discuss allowing Ukraine potentially to use long-range weapons provided by the U.S. and other Western NATO allies deep into Russian territory. President Biden has been facing increasing bipartisan pressure to try to loosen the restrictions and is signaling a new openness. The Russian President, Vladimir Putin, is delivering a rather chilling warning just ahead of today's meeting.
This is their direct involvement. And this, of course, would, in a significant way, change the very essence, the very nature of the conflict. It will mean that NATO countries, the United States and European countries, are at war with Russia.
It's basically saying it would be an active war. Our chief national security correspondent, Alex Marquardt, is here with me in the CNN newsroom. This would be a major shift if the Biden administration and other NATO allies allowed these longer-range missiles to be used, that the NATO allies are providing to Ukraine, to be used against Russian targets deeper inside Russia.
It would, and that's why we're hearing that reaction from Vladimir Putin. We are talking about the longest-range U.S. missile that the U.S. has given to Ukraine. It's called an ATACMS. It goes around 200 miles or 300 kilometers, and the Ukrainians have essentially been begging the U.S. to be allowed to use it. At the same time, they're also asking the Brits to use an equivalent missile called a Storm Shadow. That's why it's both the British and the Americans who have to come to this decision. Now, we could see a possibility in which the U.S. says, we don't want the Ukrainians to use the ATACMS, but Brits, go ahead, you guys can use, or the Ukrainians can use the Storm Shadows. But this would change the battlefield, Wolf. Now, to be clear, the U.S. has already given Ukraine permission to fire across the border with shorter range missiles. But this is, again, the longest range missile that we have seen the U.S. give to Ukraine so far. So we have seen this openness from both President Biden and his Secretary of State, who has been in the region. He was in Kyiv just a couple days ago, Secretary Blinken saying, as the battlefield changes, so too does U.S. policy evolve. This is language that we've heard in the past. So there is a good chance that the U.S. does allow this to happen. But what is the effect? There is the risk of escalation, which is really what President Biden is certainly afraid of. And we hear that threat from President Putin. There is a question of supply. There's not an infinite supply of these ATACMS. They're quite precious. And the U.S. thinks that they could be put to better use inside of Ukraine, in those Russian-occupied areas, in Crimea, for example. And then there's also the question of how much of an impact will they actually have once they're inside Russia? Now, in recent weeks, Ukrainian officials have come here to Washington to make their case. They presented a list of targets. I spoke with the Ukrainian defense minister who said that included airfields. Now, that very well may be, but U.S. officials also point to the fact that some of those Russian targets may be moved out of range. And so at the end of the day, those ATACMS may not actually be all that effective. But if the U.S. and Britain do give Ukraine that permission, it would certainly send a strong message, Wolf.
And Putin is suggesting that could be an act of war.
Yes, and this is something that we have heard from him before. Frankly, not much would change except the range on these missiles, because these missiles, shorter range missiles, are already being fired inside of Russia. But President Biden is coming under significant pressure from his own camp, from senators like Jeanne Shaheen and Ben Cardin, both of whom are on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. They would like to see the U.S. to loosen those restrictions. Even if it didn't have a major military impact, it would certainly send that message about U.S. support for Ukraine, which may be a victory in and of itself for Ukraine.
Very tense moment right now in this war that's going on. Alex Marquardt, thank you very much.
What are we hearing from D.C. right now?
Well, listen, what we're hearing from D.C. is that this is a critical meeting today between President Biden and the UK Prime Minister Starmer, specifically when it comes to Ukraine. We have reported over the course of the last few months that the Ukrainians have been pushing the United States to allow them to strike deeper inside Russia, to go after some military targets that they say are deep within Russia. The United States has been wary to allow them to do so. There's a number of reasons for that. U.S. officials are concerned about fears of escalation, Russia claiming that the United States is party to this war, but they also say that there are military strategic concerns that they have. The weaponry that the Ukrainians would be using to carry out such strikes are called ATACMS, and the U.S. says there's simply a limited supply of those in the United States, but also in Ukrainian hands. And so they think that those weapons that the Ukrainians already have could actually be used in other areas areas of the battlefield, like Crimea, don't necessarily need to go after those targets deep inside Ukraine. But Ukrainians I have spoken with say that there are legitimate targets, specifically when it comes to weapon production facilities that they would like to hit inside Russia. And so this is a critical ask for them. President Biden said that he would be hearing from his Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, who traveled this week to Ukraine on the matter. And we know that this is something that he's going to be discussing with the Prime Minister today, as the U.S. and the UK really try to work in sync when it comes to adjusting their strategy in terms of support for Ukraine. So we'll watch and see what comes out of the meeting this week. But I also think it's worth noting that there is mounting pressure on the Biden administration, not just globally from the Ukrainians, but also here in Washington. Republicans have been pushing the administration to lift these restrictions on those long-range strikes inside Russia, but also notably some Democrats, some key Democratic senators this week have put out statements saying that they too believe that now is a time to go back to those restrictions, at least adjust them in some way, shape, or form. So we'll watch and see what the Biden administration does here. We might get an announcement today. We may not. We don't know yet. But we'll be watching this incredibly closely because it is a pivotal decision for the United States to make at this moment in the Ukraine war.
It is absolutely pivotal, and given the fact that, by all accounts, they want to avoid an escalation before the upcoming elections, but we are learning about how the elections could impact this war. What are you learning, and what are the implications here?
Yeah, so there's a lot of questions about what former President Trump would do when it comes to policy on Ukraine. And he was asked during a debate earlier this week if he wants Ukraine to win the war. He would not give a direct answer to that. That is typical for him over the course of the last year or so. He is not committed to being necessarily 100% on the side of Ukraine, simply saying that the war needs to come to an end. And we heard from his vice presidential partner, J.D. Vance, earlier this week on this, and here's what he said about the matter and where he thinks former President Trump stands on this.